Friends, for the beginning of our Wednesday nights together here on Ash Wednesday, in our whole series of FaithScapes, we begin and end in the same place. We begin at the lakeshore. There's something about large open water that welcomes us. There's something about water that sort of ushers in life at the beginning and closes out in our mortality. Our mortality is, of course, the focus of Ash Wednesday. We are from dust, and to dust we shall return. But I think we can also count water in that mix. How is it that we enter into a life with our Creator? Baptism at the water's edge. And then oftentimes, my friends, I hear from many people, they want to spend their last years at the water's edge. That's certainly true of lots of retirees at Traverse City in this area. They want to spend their golden years watching the water, listening to it, reconnecting with it. And some folks, at the very end, want their cremains to be placed in a place that echoes the waters of the beginning and end of our lives. So we begin. Friends, this week we walk up the dune. We spend time in the desert. We spend time on the closest thing we have to a mountain. And we spend time with all of those terrains in our own spirit, the internal landscape. We hike up to the top and we listen to the wind. When we filmed for this segment, we were not quite prepared for what was in store. Yes, we hiked to the top. And we got to the top and started to tell stories. But the one thing we did not account for was the wind of the desert, dune, and mountain. The wind of the dunes, all dunes, my friends. The wind is what helps them form. You might say that God's most gentle reformation of the landscape, and perhaps the reformation of our own spirit, is by the wind. More gentle than glaciers, and definitely more gentle than volcanoes and earthquakes, is the gentle wind that sweeps over the sand, that sweeps over a dune in this spot, and over years of gradual sweeping, one grain of sand at a time. It moves this mountain over there. And it can do that in the span of a single generation. It can literally move a mountain. Sand, blown in the wind. The wind, along with snow and rain and other elements of the weather, it literally sculpts mountains. Some of the oldest mountains in the world are in the American East, in the Blue Ridge, and some of the mountain ranges near Appalachia. These mountains have been worn by the wind and elements. The wind is the same force that moved like the Holy Spirit over the waters in Genesis to create the earth that we live on. The wind that whispered to Job and Elijah in varying strengths is what helped them and us know that we are not the boss. God is the boss. God is the creator. God is the one that sculpts our spirits. God is the one that helps create our early terrain, our original landscape, and also helps breathe life and change into our lives and hearts. This is the wind of the desert, the dune and mountain. If you ever want to experience some of the heaviest winds, you only have to go on top of a tall hill or mountain. And you know what we forgot, my friends, as we were taping the other day. The one thing we didn't account for was that we might need one of these windscreens over the microphone that I was wearing. We got to the top and we started our taping and it was too late. We didn't have the windscreen with us. And so we went ahead anyway. You can hear us tell some stories like this one.
So here is a special place and a special time in the winter where you can see actually how the sand and the snow, they mix together. It's almost like they're dancing. They're in tandem with one another. And if we hiked further up there, and we're not going to, but if we hiked further up, we would start to step in places where our feet would give way a little bit more because of the snow, and then they would find a little bit more solid ground with the sand, and it's literally like every step. You're just not exactly sure how deep your foot's going to go because the sand and the snow have been in conversation. So I'll just take a minute to take in the barrenness of this land. And we have the added benefit of seeing a few brave souls on this very, very cold day, snowshoeing, snowboarding, sledding, and skiing on this desert, away from the desert, in the cold that is even more barren and even more harsh than it would be otherwise. This is God's creation, my friends, inviting us to slow down, to take in the wind, and listen to the sounds of simplicity. Let's keep going.
And that story might seem to be distracted by the wind. And my friends, when we come down, we realize that it is the desert and dune and high hill mountain wind that reminded us at the beginning of this project, at the beginning of these FaithScapes, that we truly are not at the center of the universe, as Job was reminded by the voice of God out of the whirlwind. But perhaps more importantly, my friends, at the top of that dune in winter, it reminded us of the desert. And folks, this great conversation that we are basing a lot of our Lenten series on by Belden Lane, he says a few things about the desert that I want to repeat to you. Not just the desert, the literal wilderness, but the desert of our spirit this Lent. What does it do, that desert, to us? What does it do? It says to move through the desert, Lane says, is to be stripped of the non-essentials in our lives and then left to survive on what's left after the desert. Humbles us, helps us be aware of our thirst, helps us be aware that life is not obviously abundant. I love it when Lane says this. He says, this is what the desert does best. Taking us to the end of ourselves, physically, culturally, spiritually, It alternately tricks and teases us into reaching for what lies beyond, for what's entirely too much for us to handle. Losing control, he says, is the point. You will only be satisfied, the desert says, by what you give up, trying to comprehend. Friends, the desert, its biggest strength is not affirming what we think that we know, but helping us to unknow the things that we thought were most important and are not. The desert, with what might seem a fierce, harsh, and uncaring wind, is actually sculpting our inner landscape as we speak, as we hike, and as we live in scarcity and abundance with one another. Winter is an interesting place to be in the dunes, to be in this desert away from the desert. Friends, this winter, may you experience the snow that defines your winter and your Lent, and allow it to dance with the sand and the wind as you go back down the great dune climb, back from your mountaintop experience, and to some of these questions for you at the bottom of the dune. We end this section on the dunes in a familiar spot, with a DH Day group campground with the dunes in the background, and a symbolic, serendipitous sign, a dead end, reminds us that up ahead is something to be reckoned with. So my question to you, my friends, is when you see or experience the dunes, the desert or mountain, what comes alive in you? What stops at a dead end? Is it a place of apprehension? Or is it a place of fierce and wonderful reckoning of God's creation? What does it bring out in you? What does the landscape of the desert, mountain, and dune invite in your internal landscape of the Spirit? This is the question we are in conversation with, in the great conversation between us and the Creator. Friends, this second FaithScape is about the countryside and the prairies. Now, growing up in St. Louis and near a big city and in the near suburbs, didn't have a whole lot of exposure personally to the prairies and the countrysides, except for maybe once a year. Every year, my family would drive out to my dad's side of the family, and we'd go to a couple of his siblings still had farms. And they were the rolling hills of western New York. And I remember getting acquainted with those areas. I knew at an early age, even if not consciously, I knew that those rolling hills and those prairies and those croplands were more than just beautiful landscape. They were God's gift, the landscape of production, of feeding, not just our spirits, but our bellies. Those croplands, as these prairies have done for probably a couple hundred years, have helped make the food and helped shelter and foster the trees that you see in the distance. God's creation feeds us, not just with our minds and our spirits, but our bellies and the stomachs of the world. the heartland, is where the countryside and the prairies really flex their muscles. So my question for you, my friends, is what do you see when you look at the rolling hills and the open lands of the countryside and the prairies? How does it feed you? Is wide open space like this something that clears your mind? Is it like a little bit like an empty drawer or a cleaned out room? Does it help you feel at peace? Does it bring a sense of order to you? Or is it a place that invites you into a different space? Because as we will talk about every week, the landscape of God's creation is but a mirror of the landscape of our spirit. They are in relationship. That is what God intended. You just have to read the Psalms in the beginning of Genesis. Several years ago, when Meredith and I first bought our house, we were enamored by many things about the house itself and the neighborhood and the street. But one of the things that also caught our eye was the trail that went around the neighborhood and through the woods, and maybe even more importantly, this vast, wide open common space behind the field, behind the trail. There is just something about it, my friends. It was something so mysterious and so untouched that literally for the first 5 or 6 years that we lived here, we never crossed the wide expanse of this common area. It just seemed almost off limits, even though it was both ours and not ours. It was both everyone's and no one's at the same time. What are those places in our world, in our states and country, and in our hearts that are vast and open and sacred and undeveloped? Largely they are untouched. Our parks, they're a great metaphor for our spirit. Their terrain can be beautiful, and in the course of today's conversation, their prairies and countryside perhaps are meant to be left untouched, at least undeveloped. About 1,000 years ago, where I'm from in St. Louis, right across the Mississippi River, was a place called Cahokia, and the Cahokian culture wound up growing into a virtual empire. And they had taken a vast open prairie land, and by digging borrow pits, moved tons and tons and tons of earth to make new mountains, mounds. The Cahokia mound culture, they transformed the landscape like humans often do, to make the original sacred into something they thought was even more. How have you transformed the prairies and countryside in your spirit? And how have you left it pristine? How have you left and yet journeyed into these vast open spaces, my friends? How we let the land shape us and how we shape the land says so much about what is in our hearts and how we develop as a people. We start vast and open. Friends, I wonder if I might know what you're thinking right now. You might see this gospel text for today, and you might see Jesus going into the temple and turning over the tables with the money changers, and you might be asking yourself, what does that gospel have to do with the wide open prairie and the countryside that Pastor Paul just talked about from the outside vantage point of a cold winter day? So here's the connection. Those people who made the temple into a marketplace, I suspect that they walked into the temple day after day, and they saw the temple as this wide open space, this prairie, this place that they thought needed to be filled. Sometimes when we look at a countryside or a prairie, we are in danger of being bored. We think that we need to add something. Whether it's like the Cahokia Mound culture, or even the folks who add just one more barn too many, as Jesus talks about in the Gospels, of the the man who has a barn that's full and he decides, I got to build another one. Friends, sometimes we look at the countryside or the inside of the temple of our hearts, and we are tempted to put something in there or in that space that keeps us from looking at the wide open expanse and giving thanks to the God that created us. We want to fill that drawer till it becomes a junk drawer, till it becomes a place where we can't find anything. And all the while, God is trying to find us. So today, this week, as we examine the outdoor countryside and prairie, I hope that you take a moment to examine the interior landscape of the wide open space of your heart, your temple, and your life with God. Because, my friends, that is the connection. Those are the dots that Jesus is trying to connect to all of us. Maybe it's time to go outside and just take it in. Let's take it in. Let's pan to the restored barn, to this place, an historic sleeping bear, a place that reminds us that we've been here for a while, but God has been here forever. Friends, for this week, we're going to focus on the city as a landscape. I think we don't often realize that buildings do change the contours of the land. And it does depend also, of course, on how big the city is and how the architects may have chosen to sculpt the cityscape. It's also good to reflect on maybe what some of our first tastes of the city, our first orientations, if you will. I remember when I was a very young person, a child, my first taste of the city was overwhelming. I wasn't living in a huge city. I was living in St. Louis, Missouri. But I remember my father taking me downtown in St. Louis to a jewelry store and just being almost overtaken by the tall buildings and the endless streets and loud traffic and vehicles moving everywhere and people walking about. It took a while to get used to. And I thought that was the big city. And then when I moved to Chicago later on in my adulthood, I'll never forget those first couple years in seminary. this is before GPSs were readily available. If I ever had to go anywhere, whether it was the city or the sprawling suburbs, I always went to MapQuest first. MapQuest was secondary only to the Bible as far as finding my way around in life for a while. What is it about the city that affects us? Does it overwhelm you? Does it give you energy? Or perhaps, my friends, it's both. Wanted to spend a few moments, if possible, if anybody's willing to talk to me here in downtown Traverse City on a Sunday afternoon, asking folks some of those questions. Do you have a spiritual connection to a city? If so, where? Could you say more about it? And as you're walking through the city streets, is there something within you that is going on that's different than walking through a trail or down a street that's not populated with people and buildings? These are spiritual questions, my friends. These are questions that affect our whole being as we walk through life in our faith, our landscape, and our FaithScape. I'll end with a story that's very personal to me, but before we get there, I'd like to hear from other folks. I'm here with Hannah, and we were talking about spiritual connections in the city. And so Hannah, my first question for you is, do you have a spiritual connection with a city or town of some sort?
I do. So when I went to school college. I went to college in Saginaw Valley, Saginaw. So I lived in Saginaw for 7 years, and I worked in a few churches there, and I had a lot of involvement in church there, more as an adult, And I met a lot of my friends down there who have become lifelong friends who are also Christians. So for me, when I'm down there, I feel very connected to God in a more mature way than, I guess, in my hometown where I was going to Sunday school because my parents took me,
Sure. Yeah, and one thing that I remember from what we talked about earlier is that you had met so many Christian friends in Saginaw that the city itself kind of symbolizes a place of connection for faith and for other people.
Absolutely.
Sort of like a hub of your spirituality in some ways, right?
Absolutely. And those are the people in my life that I still talk to, I would say, the most about my spirituality. I'm still, even though I'm up here and they're down there now, we're still very involved with each other's faith journey, I guess.
Excellent. Could you say something about my second question, which we already talked about, and that is, what is it like to walk the streets of a city for you compared to maybe what it's like for you to walk a trail or a street that's not necessarily having a lot of buildings and people?
Sure. So I love Traverse City for this. There's a lot to do. There's a lot happening. There's a lot to see. But it can be distracting. I mean, if you are, if you're going shopping for just one specific thing in a big city, it's really easy to see someone or see something that you want to do instead, and you kind of get pulled out of whatever you might have been aiming for. In sometimes in great ways, sometimes in negative ways, but that's just how it is. Whereas if you're in a more secluded area in the woods, on a trail, even just in a smaller town, you don't have that as much. It's a lot more serene. You can focus. You can get more comfortable with whatever it is that you're trying to do.
Yeah, and you and I talked a little bit about how that experience that you're talking about, that being distracted walking through the city, is kind of a snapshot of our life. I mean, our regular lives we're so susceptible to distraction, whether it's technology or other people or just other things happening. But walking on the trail for you, and I think this is kind of universal, walking outside of the city may not be better or worse, but it does give us a chance to focus our energies in our spirit and really give God a fair shake for our attention.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that anytime you're able to really devote the focus that certain things need. I mean, maybe your grocery list doesn't need that kind of focus, but your faith should get it. I think your prayer life should get it. really making sure that you surround yourself or you give yourself opportunities for that. I mean, even if it's in a busy street like this that you're really going to be plugged in, whatever works. But being intentional, I think, is really important.
And you could have a holy moment
Anywhere.
in a city, but it's just...
Yeah.
It's all relative, but at the same time, it's very tied to place in some ways.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, you too.
Alrighty. So my friends, I said that I wanted to end with this story about the city, and I want to share with you a personal story about walking through the city streets and just being in an unfamiliar city. I mean, even just under a year having been in Chicago, a place that I had never lived before, a seismic change happened in my life. As many of you know, my mother passed away at the tail end of my first year in seminary. And there was a song that was so important to her and to our family, but I didn't know it until we got together to plan for her funeral. But as we were in the city of Chicago, 3 things happened. One, in a church where I was doing some field work, my family came in town, and it was just after my mother's funeral, and the song "I Know That My Redeemer Lives" was the song of the day. That was the song of the day at her funeral. And then we also received word that my mom had planned the whole service, and looking back, she had chosen that to be the song of the day for her funeral. But perhaps, my friends, the most striking was in the city. Wandering through the downtown streets of Chicago, going from one place to the other. It wasn't an extraordinary trip. There wasn't a big meeting that I was going to. I was literally just walking from one end of downtown Chicago to the other. But I Know That My Redeemer Lives was still heavy on my mind. And as I rounded the corner, a city cathedral church was playing on its bells. I know that my Redeemer lives. We don't think about the city as a overtly spiritual place, my friends, but there are spiritual moments happening all the time. The city is where people gather in large numbers. The city is where people go for events that cannot be held anywhere else. The city is where there is energy and life and sports and music and get-togethers and restaurants that bring us all together. And they bring us all together for many reasons. But as Christians, we know that we are brought together sometimes for reasons that are only revealed later, like the song that comes months after the moment. The city, that is the landscape around us and within that transforms us. What is your cityscape moment in a town like Traverse, or in a big city like Chicago, or somewhere else? That is the cityscape and landscape, the FaithScape, that we honor today. Our next FaithScape is what we're calling valleys and canyons. You can see this familiar side of the Boardman River just south of town. It's a special site for more than one reason. It's a special site because just a couple of years ago, one of the key dams along the Boardman River was removed. And so we are standing right now where a lake used to be. And now the river has once again returned to its normal, natural course. But if we are silent long enough, we can hear the force that cut this valley a long, long time ago. Greetings, my friends. We started out this segment in this FaithScape by the side of a river, in a river valley known well to those in Traverse City. But I want to keep going with this. I want to keep going with the river and the valleys and the canyons. The first thing that I want to say is that rivers cut through things. They do it gracefully, though, and they do it over tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of years. And so when we see the byproduct, or I should say the product, that rivers and water make obvious in our lives, we don't really think about how it got there, do we? We come up to a river valley and we see it as what it is and not what it used to be. But God's grace, like a river, like the still waters in Psalm 22, they weren't always still, and even in their stillness, they were doing something. God's grace is continually flowing over the rock and the soil of our hearts and spirit. And friends, even though we can't see it, or others might not be able to see it at the surface, God's grace is doing something. God's Spirit is gently but firmly moving through the spaces, breaking open loose rock, and literally changing the contour of us. God is the only one who can fill the empty space. And my friends, we have to let God occupy that space. We have to let God flow over us in God's grace. Here's another way of looking at it. In The Great Conversation by Belden Lane, the book that we are studying both in these Wednesday nights and on Wednesday noon book study times, Belden Lane quotes in the section about rivers, he talks about a famous Chinese philosopher whose name was Lao Tzu, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he said this about rivers and the way of water. It's on page 177 if you want to check it out. He says, all streams flow to the sea because it is lower than they are. In other words, humility, he says, gives water its power. Now, my friends, the scientist in all of us might say, well, it's gravity that gives the water and the river its power. That's just a natural phenomenon. And that may be true. But it is the humility of moving from a higher place to a lower place that truly opens up and breaks open that rock. That solid sort of frozenness of our spirit. And friends, quite honestly, if God wanted to give water the power of moving up, God would have done it. But God moves within the natural world and the non-miraculous, maybe more than the miraculous. Lao Tzu also likens the river valley to the mysterious womb of our lives of faith. It is the mother of 10,000 things. It creates a chasm, a valley, a canyon, carved by falling water, and it gives us an inner emptiness that needs not to be filled. Friends, if you want to experience the inner emptiness, go by yourself to a canyon where rock walls surround you on both sides and let that empty space sink in. The vast, empty space of something that has been obviously carved by the water of God's grace. It means something. What is the canyon that God has created for you? And are you pausing to remember how that canyon or valley was created? It didn't come haphazardly. It didn't come accidentally. It came by years of flowing water. This naked vulnerability, as Belden Lane says, this nothingness of God that is in that carved open place. It's so important. This empty canyon or peaceful valley where the souls of the beloved are. Friends, God dwells in the empty place. Where does the resurrected Christ embrace you? How in the empty place of canyon, valley, tomb does Christ come to you with new life? Maybe one final way of looking at this is the gospel text for this coming weekend. Here's the connection, my friends. Jesus says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it will not bear fruit. Friends, unless the river of water falls and falls and falls and falls, moving as gravity and, yes, humility brings it further and further down to the sea and further out to carve this canyon and valley in your spirit. Unless that water moves, it cannot bear a new terrain. It cannot unearth what is underneath the rock, waiting to be broken open to a new terrain and a new flow and a new path. My friends, as we get ready to round this out, these valleys, these canyons, they mean something. They are beautiful in their own right, but they are part of the path that Jesus and the Spirit and the Creator in community are carving for you. We close with the sights and sounds of still waters. Friends, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and indeed even at the end, he met his people. He met his Father at the water's edge. At his baptism in the River Jordan, Christ was welcomed into his calling, into the 3 or so odd years where he would take the gospel beyond where John the Baptist and all the other prophets had. He would show them and be that gospel. The message would be the messenger. And so in our gospel passage for this coming weekend, the processional gospel of Palm Sunday, Jesus calls the people to bring forth a medium. It's not quite like water. He's actually calling them to untie and bring a donkey with them so that he can ride into Jerusalem. But make no mistake, my friends, Jesus is thinking of that baptism in the River Jordan, because this is now where things actually take off. This is where Jesus' ministry meets the powers of the world. This is the beginning and the end and the beginning of the end. The bookends of Christ's kingdom in the little time that he had. So in the processional gospel, we have Jesus calling the people to bring the donkey so that he can ride into Jerusalem. And then he has the people honoring him with palms and cloaks and cries of Hosanna. But in our FaithScape for this week, our final of our FaithScapes, in a sense, we are talking about the beginning and end of our ministry and our life with God as well on earth before the life everlasting. Where are we met at the beginning of our ministry? Right here at the baptismal font. The water of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is either sprinkled on us or it is an immersion with us. This grace of God is not just around us, it is over top of us, it is through us. It is the place of beginning and, metaphorically, the place of the end. And while you might not see water in this gospel passage quite so clearly, you know that Jesus went to the water's edge to find his disciples, and that many of us want our last days to be at the contemplative, peaceful water's edge, where we can so clearly see the power of God in big water, the power of God in the remembrance of creation itself, as the Spirit of God moved over the waters at the beginning of our planet's life. At the water's edge is what we take a look at tonight. My friends, let us celebrate this upcoming Palm Sunday and the beginning of Holy Week by returning in our spirit to the edge of the lake, and the edge of the sea, and the edge where God's grace washes us of our sin and smooths over the rough edges of our humanity and saves us. Our fifth and final FaithScape, our faith landscape, if you will, is just as much about water as it is about land. We're standing in the place where we began this journey just 5 weeks ago, on the edge of Lake Michigan, on the corner of Clinch Park, on a boardwalk. Friends, when I was growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, there was no great lake to be found. As a matter of fact, until later in my life was really the time when I was even exposed to any lake or sea or ocean of any significance. It still reminded me that I did not take lakes for granted, but after living next to them for many years now, I have a tendency to do that. I'll tell you a story in a moment, but what I want to do is focus on what other people have told me about lakes and water, people who have been living on the edge of these waters for quite a while. I asked them, I said, well, when you think of a spiritual landscape or a seascape or a lakeshore, what do you think of? Immediately, thoughts went to the purification that water does. It literally washes our wounds and cleanses the sin and other things in our lives that pile up. Not unlike, as we mentioned at the beginning, the baptism, the spiritual bath, the cleansing, the welcoming into God's family, and the descending and ascending in and out of the waters. The other thing was the obvious one, I guess, for us Christian folk. Where was it that Jesus found his first disciples? Walking along the lakeshore, gathering the fishermen who were used to finding fish and would learn to find people. The soothing sounds of the water, the ebb, the crash, the ripple, the flow of big water coming in to the beach, whether it's a lake or an ocean. There's something about that, is it not? Something soothing, invigorating, humbling. And finally, the calm of those things that live along the water. Not just the people, not just the animals, but the trees that give us air. Part of the cycle of life. My friends, how is it that you connect to the actual lakeshore or the lakeshore of your spirit that holds the water, that is the life in you? I want to end with a story that happened in this very place, on this very boardwalk, just a couple of weeks ago. My son Parker is going through the stage where he loves big boats. He loves ships. And so the new thing is he loves to watch videos of ore ships. Ships that literally carry ore from the upper Great Lakes to the lower. And there's one particular ship that he somehow got acquainted with, and we watched videos of this ore ship. And the ore ship has a name. They all do. And this one is the American Courage. Friends, I couldn't make that up. And after watching the American Courage videos 50 times, the other day we heard on the news that there was an ore ship that had come into this very bay to avoid the storms in the big water of Lake Michigan. They didn't say what the name of the ship was, and we piled in the car after work, and I picked up Parker from school, and we came down to this very boardwalk to look at this huge ore ship. And it was just far enough away, and it was just cloudy and foggy, kind of like it is today. So we couldn't tell the name of the ship. We were just delighted to see one. We've been talking about seeing an ore ship for so long. But Parker always wanted to see the American Courage, so he was asking me, Dad, when can we go to see the American Courage? And I'm looking up schedules, and I'm trying to figure out, well, when could we possibly go up north to find it? And then on a lark, I looked up that news story a day or so later, and the very ship that we had seen that day, the only ore ship we'd ever seen on this lakeshore, was the American Courage. My friends, we end these Lenten Wednesdays where we began, but not just thinking of our mortality, but the things that are always right before us that we do not see. What are the things that you have witnessed and have been invigorated by and not even known that they are what you had sought the whole time? That is the thought, the reflection I want to leave you with on this FaithScape journey as we turn the corner now and head into the holiest of Holy Weeks. How is it that Christ has been with you? You've even seen him from a distance, not knowing who he was. May it give you courage as we enter this final week. And may your landscape of faith be something that you can now see perhaps a little clearer than you had before. God is there in this landscape and in your eternal landscape. We go to the water's edge to be met by Jesus today and always. Amen.
Jesus.